Effectively, what this report, which was released in March, and it's looking at data from 2025, pretty much saying that Australia, we were in the top 10 for music nations, I suppose, and my assumption is that this is taking in, touring and live music revenue as well as streaming data, physical. My assumption is it's taking in the whole package relating to music. In Australia, we're in the top 10. We've now slipped outside of the top 10, and I suppose the concern is it's now the second year in a row that we've slipped down the rankings.
We need Australian exposure to Australian music. It's not happening in a lot of other places, not in our online worlds. The streaming algorithm isn't doing it very well. Radio listenership is down. This is an opportunity to showcase great Australian artists to Australians.
Gentlemen, this is Democracy Manifest.
No, I don't go to that many shops. I don't. There's not that many options, but I couldn't remember. Unless it was Aldi, but I don't think it was. Maybe it was Aldi.
Aldi, in my experience, don't play music.
That's what I'm thinking, yeah.
It's very quiet in there, which is both nice but also a little bit jarring.
Yes, and often quite cold with all their open fridges. Like you'll be fine outside in shorts and then you go inside and it's fucking freezing.
Yeah.
But I still love Aldi.
Good old Aldi.
But yes, Cam, we spoke on a couple of the last music news with regard to the unexpected closure of Drifters Wharf in Gosford. And in that, I was mentioning to you that I saw that Radium Dolls are coming to town. I was like, yes, that's wicked. I will be attending. And then like the next day, the Drifters news happened and I was like, bugger. However, then they were going, well, we're going to, reschedule all gigs. The tickets have been sold to, et cetera, et cetera. And lo and behold, they moved it to Long Jetty, which is like much better for me to get to than Drifters would have been. So I went along on Saturday night to Long Jetty Pub, had the band room open, and they had Radium Dolls playing with a great list of local supports, which I don't have in front of me.
Do you know what's funny? Before we record, Eamon's like, this is the most prepared I feel like I've been for a music news in a little while. And we're 10 seconds in and he's immediately Googling something.
I know, sorry. I know who I saw, but I know who I need to remember who I didn't see. So I saw Stupid Baby, who were unreal there. I didn't see Jan. That's right. We had Darty. I saw Stupid Baby and Darty. I didn't see Jan and I didn't see Donuts, unfortunately. Jan, I'm particularly filthy about because I've just wanted to see them for ages. And I was at like a family dinner before then, which I had a great time at. No begrudging the family dinners. But I was like, oh, Jan will be a little bit later. And I got there and I just missed Jan. But it was a really good night. I was like, that's that lineup. So it was like a bit of a heavier lineup when you stack all those bands together. Was like, I don't know, it was really well suited to the band room in Long Jetty. Like it just fit the vibe of the music. There was a really good showing, good turnout there of people all loving it. And yeah, just a really good night, good gig. I was a big fan. I've been, hadn't been to a gig at Long Jetty in a little while, but the band room was like the most I've enjoyed that band room. Whether it was the crowd or just the lineup. I think the lineup suited really well. But yeah, unreal. Stupid Baby were fantastic. There was, we had crowd surfing and shoulders going on for Stupid Baby, which was unreal. Darty were really good. And Radium Dolls, who were voted Queensland's best live act, I think over a couple of years. So I knew they were going to be good, but they exceeded my expectations in terms of a live performance. They were really, really good. It's like their lead singer, it's just him and the mic, so he's not on an instrument, and he carried that energy. Like his energy on stage was so well. He really had a great stage presence, and like attitude in the best kind of way, and it was really, really good. So really nice to see, like, that the gigs have been moved, the people have still attended, and everyone in the scene was still frothing on a good night. So I really, really enjoyed it. Shout out to Long Jetty Pub for taking on the gig. And it just kind of hopefully proves us, not these gigs were just going to go kaput, but talking about the strength of the scene in our area on the Central Coast, like the big draw card venue has closed temporarily or permanently. We're not really sure what's going on just yet. The gigs have moved, the people have remained, and the scene kicks on, which is really, really nice.
It is, yeah. And we had a lot of engagement on our postings around that on social media as well. A lot of comments coming in, sharing your thoughts and opinions around, Drifters Wharf as a venue itself, but also its place in the local music scene and, why. I think a lot of people shared our thoughts on it is that our local scene now is strong enough where if this happened, 4 years ago, it would have been a massive blow to the region, but it does feel like now we've got a lot more independent venues popping up. We could see another venue, put their hands up to be the premier venue to get the touring acts coming to town. Or, as we said, Drifters could still reopen. We don't know what's happening with that, but either way, we think the local scene is in a good place, and a lot of you shared similar thoughts and opinions on that as well.
Yeah, thanks for your engagement. And if you're a new listener or viewer, if you're watching us on our YouTube version, which we now have, if you're wondering, if you want to see us kind of talking with a visual element like us in the screen, in your screen, looking at you, but we're not actually looking at you, but you can think we're talking directly to you.
No, I'm staring intently.
Yeah, so am I. Then you can do that on YouTube now. And, you'll see kind of usually me fiddling around as well sometimes, moving and like I just like jig all the time, and I'm really having to be conscious of that now because it's kind of recorded all the time. So you can see all that if you are so inclined.
You might catch an Aaron nose pick or something, You might see me yawning as Eamon's explaining a very data-driven story. There's
you might see me clipping my toenails as Cam discusses the ins and outs of AI and streaming. So it's really the world's your oyster if you want it to be. But if you are a new listener, welcome. We hope we haven't turned you away just yet. Give us maybe 10 more minutes and you'll turn us off. But while we have you, thank you. My name is Eamon. Cam is the other voice, or the guy in the beanie if you're watching it.
Not often I wear a beanie.
Guy. It is, but, actually. I haven't given that enough of a focus.
Yeah, no, it was a little. Like, it's not. I wouldn't say it's super cold at my house at the moment, but I certainly do feel the cold in my house in the winter. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to pull out the beanie for this episode because why not?
Homebrewed winter edition.
We're
an all seasons podcast apart from summer this year, but we are doing a music news episode this week. So if you are new, we do weekly releases. 1 week you're going to hear an interview with an artist. Sometimes they're from our area of the Central Coast. Sometimes they are a national band or a music personality as well. We get those in from time to time. And the other week we cover the goings on within Australian music. So this is a music news episode that you've got us for. This is the analysis. This is just us talking, not an artist talking. So, that may be your worst nightmare, in which case buckle up. But we do have a few stories to bring you for this one. Starting with, and I suppose the gig that I attended on the weekend kind of flows in this direction. This is Spotify's data-driven revelation that heavy music is on the rise in a big way globally, but also across Australia. And not only did I find this interesting, on face value, but also the reasons that Joe Kahn, who is Spotify ANZ's music editor, formerly, I believe, of Triple J and FBI Radio, Joe Kahn, the reasons that he's attributed this to. So we're going to get into that, and we've got a couple more coming your way after that. But to start with that story, Spotify has amassed a bunch of data, as it does, being the world's largest global streaming platform. We have beef with Spotify. I think we've been pretty open about that. However, they, you can't deny their ability to gather good data. And so they have found that Australians are increasingly turning towards heavier music genres. They found from 2020 to 2025, metal streams surged by 105%, punk and rock genres pushed up by 80%. So they're saying, signaling a shift towards heavy music. And that same trend is apparently taking hold across the globe. So over the last 5 years, heavy music has outpaced gains in other genres and areas of music. So dance and electronic music is up 74%, these are all quite big numbers on their own. Pop is up by 63%, hip hop 31%. The heavy music rise globally is up 115% in metal streams. Punk is up 168%.
That's huge.
And rock is up 96%. So you combine that lot. That is a significant increase in that kind of broader sound.
And this is while Taylor Swift is still the most dominant musician on the planet. So, collectively, the heavier scene is seeing a massive surge and a massive rise. I go back to sort of, high school, teenage years, which is quite a long time ago now, sadly, admittedly. But I don't know how you'd classify some of these acts in terms of what genre they fit into. But I think, the pop punk, Panic at the Disco, Blink-182, Fall Out Boy, this era of music then sort of transitioned into more of your Rise Against, A Day to Remember. Like that era that's probably the heaviest I've listened to and enjoyed. But then obviously, fallen away from that sort of stuff the last, 10 years or so, got back more into more the indie and the folk and that sort of stuff. But to see the resurgence of the heavier music is quite interesting. And, we often talk about the heavy music scene in Australia having a real hardcore niche. No pun intended with the hardcore, but it is, a hardcore niche where we have the people who are into it are really into it, but we were talking about the scale and it might not be as big, but you always see, a couple of heavy tracks making it in the hottest 100, and it's because of that hardcore fan base. But now you could see multiple tracks making the hottest 100 because it is on the rise.
Yeah, it is. It is. And just for like a bit of, I suppose, context, this is, as I kind of alluded to, it's not just like, we're not just talking metal, we're talking metal punk, we're talking rock as well. So there's it's a wider net, what we're talking about here, but all of it does fall into that kind of heavier sound.
Well, that was why I tried to outline my own listening, because I was like, look, it's
so you're in that realm.
Sometimes it blends genres a little bit, and even a certain band can also chop and change genres as well. That's obviously not unique, but it is. Oh, no, the nostalgic part of me is like, it's nice to see it increase. And when I hear, newer acts, putting like even, like a slowly sort of like they've got a real pop punk type of element to it. And every time I listen to them, I'm like, oh, I feel a bit nostalgic for that. So I don't know how much nostalgia is playing, but there's some data to suggest that it's more than nostalgia, which could be contributing to the massive increase in this type of music being listened to.
Yeah, I think so. I reckon I've contributed to this data over the last few years, particularly like artists like Dead Shows and Jan from the Central Coast. I've been really loving. And then Radium Dolls, for example, the Pretty Littles who we had on last year, they've definitely into that side of things. I've had a bit more of a penchant for like emo, I think, generally in like one corner of my sounds that I enjoy. So I reckon I've contributed to this a bit as well. We've also seen really big artists like Speed coming out of Sydney, and we spoke about them when they won the New South Wales Music Prize, and how they kind of like have managed to capture a sound, like a subset of listeners who maybe we didn't think would be into, like a greater portion of listeners who we didn't think, might exist. With Speed, they've been really, really good. And so often in these scenes as well, like the loveliest, most community-driven bands come from the heavier side of music, I find quite often as well. But yeah, so they're talking about artists as well coming to tour Australia, from people like Metallica, Green Day, Linkin Park, AC/DC, who have, been continuing to, define parts of Australian rock music as well. Sleep Token have been huge. So yeah, I think it's just cool data. But what I found really, really interesting about this, and we spoke about Spotify ANZ's music editor, Joe Kahn, he believes that a lot of this may be driven by inflation, cost of living, war, the absolute shit show that is geopolitics in the 2020s, the ridiculousness of it. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I don't know. I
God, you're
misspoke.
dramatic.
It's completely normal. Everything's fine. But we are going through like an absolutely insane time period. And I don't think that's just I'm living through it, so I think it's insane. I speak to my parents, I speak to people older than me a lot, and I kind of always ask this because I'm conscious of it. And they're always like, "No, this is fucking really nuts what's going on." And I feel like you observe the world, from like the last decade, but particularly from 2020 onwards. And I always just measure it in terms of ridiculousness. And I think the ridiculousness of some of the things that have been going on is only increasing, and we're getting more desensitized to it. So that's you don't need me to explain to you the state of the world. Most people are very well aware. But I think it's really interesting that Joe Kahn is kind of pointing to these issues as driving an increase into the listenership of heavy music. He says, quote, "It's impossible to speak to the rise of these new genres without acknowledging the pressures shaping how people are feeling right now. As audiences navigate post-pandemic realities, cost of living pressures, and an increasingly uncertain and divided world, they're reconnecting with genres that have long offered catharsis, resistance, and a sense of belonging, making rock, punk, and metal feel more relevant and vital than ever." What do you make of that, Cam?
I find that really interesting. And, correlation or causation, I think there's an argument to be had there. Like we look at, since the pandemic, it's been on the rise, but also, could it just be that it's having a moment? Like there is maybe people feeling nostalgia for it. There is a bit more excitement around it, more exposure for it as well globally. Perhaps there is, I've certainly noticed more of it, on Triple J being played outside of the specialty programs. You hear it played more broadly, I think. I don't know how much of it is caused by that, but certainly, you look back to the punk movements, of the 80s and 90s, and that certainly does feel inspired by similar sorts of things. Like it's almost an uprising against, the norm or society and all of that. So I can certainly see why people would feel comfort in that in, today's, geopolitical climate and all the chaos that's going on. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. At first when I read this, I was like, nah, like I think it's just a coincidence, like that similarly we've seen a rise in country music in the last 5 years. That's really like breaking into the mainstream and attracting audiences that were never expected to be fans of it, and a wider audience, which is great. And I thought this was another example. It just happens to be occurring at a time that all this shit is happening in the world. But then the more I thought about it, I was like, well, there can't be no link. I don't think that there's no link. I think there's a correlation, and the extent to which it contributes is debatable. But we do know, as you said, that, like the punk movement rose, ultimately out of a culture of resistance and frustration. And we also know bands operating in this space are generally very outspoken and can often be a lot more literal in their delivery of messages. But we're seeing political, like responsive and reactive music across the spectrum of genres, but it definitely is in the heavy world. And there is no denying that kind of extra level of catharsis and expression, I think, that you can gain through heavy music, particularly like even like moshing as a general rule amongst those kind of crowds. It's like very much part of the culture. You get in there, you swing yourself around, you get knocked down, you get picked up. And that is an ultimate kind of expression and response. And I think for a lot of people is very, very cathartic. So I think it's not nothing. I don't know the extent to which, but I think it's not nothing. And of course, I think it'd be really ignorant of me to say, no, it has no contribution, because music is always, and culture is always a reaction to the events of our lives and our worlds at that moment in time. And it's a very, very much a reflection of it. There's very few acts that are just making things in a vacuum. So I think, when you combine all of those things, yes, I think that would have to be true. Whether it's, 80% of it or 20% of it, I can't speak to, but I think it's contributing a fair bit. And I just thought, it's a very interesting little glimpse into, like how culture is reflecting us in these times and kind of the impacts of that. And I hopefully for people it is offering a kind of release from the ridiculousness that often floods our feeds and timelines and TV screens and lives, and fuel bowsers at the moment too. So
Yeah,
cool, interesting info.
Yeah, and when I said nostalgia, it wasn't necessarily like, oh God, I remember those days. I remember loving this band. I also mean, I mentioned the comfort that can come with that too, right? Like when you're a teenager, you're filled with angst and just general anxiety and nerves and pressures from society. Plus also you can't afford to do anything. You have no independence. And now in the current world, you could be feeling a lot of those same things. You could feel anxiety over the future of the planet. You could be feeling, you can't afford to go anywhere or do anything. You might not feel as independent or free as you were because you don't have, the financial freedoms, and listening to that sort of music again could put you back in that place. And there's also, a lot of, new wave artists that we've been talking about also pushing those sorts of boundaries. And as you said, sort of finding audiences where they might not have necessarily expected to be found as well. So there's a lot of contributing factors here. And yeah, I'm with you. I don't think you can rule it out and say, nah, it's just a coincidence. But yeah, how strong that connection is, I suppose, like how strongly global factors are actually influencing the rise of it, or how much of it is just these artists who are pushing boundaries and finding new audiences, and maybe the TikTok of it all as well, and the onlineness of it all, finding your little communities. Maybe that's also having just as big an impact, because you mentioned country music as well. Like, could we just be seeing a parallel rise in that essence as well? People finding, through algorithms and streaming, they don't need to listen to the top 40. Maybe there's a bit of top 40 fatigue as well. So people are finding different avenues for music they enjoy. I don't know.
Yeah. It's a really interesting question. And if you listening have reflections on that, please let us know. We'd love to hear. What's your thoughts? Like, have you found yourself, do you think you're contributing to that, hundreds of % increase in the world of heavy music over the last 5 years or so? And if so, do you have can you kind of pinpoint a reason? I think it's kind of hard for us to verbalize why we like certain things sometimes, or what's driven that change. So I understand if it's not necessarily easy, because I'm wondering the same thing for myself. But if you can point to that, we'd love to hear about it. And maybe even if you are, and have always been a fan of that side of music, tell us why. What does it do for you? What does it make you feel? It's a really interesting conversation, and it does get to the heart, like, of these. If I can, tie it into our broader music news web, which regular listeners, would know is very vast, but it's why culture is so important and impactful and needs to be recognized as such by the people who lead us and make decisions for us, because this is an example of that. If you choose to believe, that there is a relationship between these two things, this is an example of that. So, it could tie well into a discussion we're probably going to have in a couple of weeks about what Ireland's doing right now with regard to artists, but we'll leave that there.
Well, I think it actually ties in really well to the next story for the music news as well, if you're ready to move on to that, and how culture, or rather a lack of culture, could really influence and play a part in, not just, the feelings and emotions, I suppose, of a nation, but also how art is received in a lot of these countries, because Australia's position on the global music industry has fallen for a second year in a row. This is according to the latest global music report from the International Federation of the Phonographic Industry, or IFPI, which...
IFPI. Can we call them IFPI? Is that...
I don't know if that's the official term, but it's a lot easier than IFPI. So IFPI.
Yeah, we're going to run IFPI for this episode, just so everyone knows. IFPI refers to the IFPI, refers to the International Federation of the Phonographic Industry, which we'd chew up an hour just repeating that over this story.
Yeah, pretty much IFPI, they're the organisation that represents the interest of the recording industry worldwide. They're a not-for-profit members organisation registered in Switzerland, which I think all good not-for-profit and neutral companies seem to be based out of Switzerland, except... Is FIFA in Switzerland?
Yeah, I don't know. I think they are. No, Zurich. Yeah, Zurich. Hang on.
Zurich, Switzerland, I'm pretty sure. Geography lesson on the spot.
Where is FIFA based? Google. Yeah, Zurich, Switzerland. They
Yes. So outside of FIFA, Switzerland seems to be a good place for not-for-profit neutral companies and organisations to be based. But so their mission is to promote the value of recorded music, campaign for record producer rights, and expand the commercial uses of recorded music. Effectively, what this report, which was released in March, and it's looking at data from 2025, pretty much saying that Australia, we were in the top 10 for music nations, I suppose. And my assumption is that this is taking in, touring and live music revenue, as well as streaming data, physical. My assumption is it's taking in the whole package relating to music. In Australia, we're in the top 10. We've now slipped outside of the top 10. And I suppose the concern is it's now the second year in a row that we have slipped down the rankings.
Yes. Yeah, it's some pretty sobering numbers, I think, for Australia. And we can attribute this to a number of things, which we'll get into. Just a quick note on IFPI as well. I hope they use IFPI. It sounds fun. Makes them sound kind of cute. But they are funded entirely by the recorded music industry. So they have a membership, which is made up of record labels and even our own ARIA is part of the membership. And that's kind of what their funding is. The reason I searched that is because when you're reading through the report, and I don't know, this is me probably looking with an overly critical eye, but they're very uncritical of major record labels, where I think, maybe that type of criticism isn't warranted in a report like this, but they were very, pro the benefits of major record labels, which I'm not denying, but there's also, as we've discussed, a lot of issues with major record labels right now. And I think they are some of the biggest funders. And I just thought that's an interesting bit of context for you to take when we give you this information. I still think that the data that we're going to deliver has no bearing on that. But when they were very, bullish on major record labels, I just thought it was worth including that. But yeah, we are coming.
You've got to be mindful when you are looking at reports of where the reporters come from, and then I suppose, who funds that company, who puts the report on, sort of thing. Same way, if you're looking at any report to do with whether it's climate impacts or war or geopolitics, look at where the report's coming from, and then, as much as I think a lot of organisations try not to have biases, there are always going to be some sort of biases in place.
And just quickly, if you want to influence our work and set our agenda, we have a Patreon. So you can just go Patreon, Homebrewed Media, and if you contribute enough money, we will say whatever you want us to say. We are completely capturable. We can be bought. We have a price. It's not that high. It's really not. So just experiment with a couple of numbers and we can literally be your personal podcast. Go to Patreon/Homebrewed Media, find us there, and support us if you do like what we're doing and
actually
want to capture us.
Quick note, I know you're making a joke whilst also doing a plug, but also a quick note, if you are on our Patreon tier at I think it's a Feed Your Family in 2017 tier, which is because Kyle was promised in 2017 to feed your family for $10. That is our second tier of Patreon, $10 a month. If you subscribe at that tier or above, you get ad-free access to our podcasts, which you can link your Patreon account to Spotify if that is your podcasting platform of choice, or your PPOC, as we like to say. If that is there, you can link those accounts and you get ad-free content straight in the exact same feed that you would normally get our podcast. And also what we've done the last couple of weeks, maybe not this one, I don't know, but we are trying to upload the podcast a little bit early as well. So you also get early access plus ad-free content as well through the Patreon on the Feed Your Family in 2017 tier. But if you're not on the Patreon, that's fine. You can still access our content as you normally would. Nothing there has changed except for the fact that we are now starting to monetize this podcast a little bit more as well, because as you're aware, the world is falling apart and cost of living is hard, and the cost of us to put on this podcast is increasing. So that's what we're trying to cover our costs with the Patreon as well. And with that Patreon too, you can also contribute towards future, I suppose, a rebirthing of a couple of series that we would like to redo but need finances for. And if you are a contributor to that, you will certainly be in our good graces and get many, many good wishes if that does come to fruition. So thank you to anyone who is on our Patreon. Thank you if you do sign up off the back of this. But anyway, hi, it's us. Sorry to interrupt us, but we're here with an important message from our sponsor, Sonora Studios.
Yes, go to Sonora Studios. And we will expand upon that message. Jack was really brief in what he sent us.
It was just all caps, go to Sonora.
Well, take that advice if you want. But if you are a musician or a music producer and you're looking for a space to record your work or record the work of others or work out of, we would like to highly recommend Sonora Studios in Tuggerah for you to do that. It's a fantastic space curated by Jack Negro. Very welcoming, unreal place to record out of, at least for podcasts, but we know based on all the musicians we spoke to that it's fantastic for music as well. It's got everything, a very well-designed, well-thought-out place with some of literally the best producers in the country and some of the best bands in the country frequenting it. So do check out Sonora Studios if that is what you're looking for.
This message will now be self-destruct and we'll continue
Cam's
with our
just
discussion.
spontaneously combusted.
I did.
I hope he's good to carry on with the rest of this episode. But yes, we're talking about IFPI. We're talking about Australia's place in the global music market. So the global market overview side of this report posted a list of the top 10 markets, and once again for the second year in a row, did not include Australia. On that global market overview, last year we had 8 of the global top 10 markets recording year-on-year growth. And last year was when we, in Australia, fell out of the top 10 for the first time since 1996. So nearly 30 years. Sorry. For nearly 30 years, we fell out of the top 10 for the first time. So quite significant. We dropped into the 11th place. This year, so globally, every region of the world recorded revenue growth for the 6th consecutive year, and every one of the global top 10 markets posted year-on-year growth, whereas last year it was 8 of the global top 10 markets. And this year, though, we dropped to 13th, and Latin America became the fastest growing region. So we dropped a further 2 places from last year. That top 15, I'll rattle off really quickly, starting at number 1, obviously. USA, Japan, UK, China, Germany, France, South Korea, Brazil, Canada, Mexico, Italy, Spain, Australia, India, Netherlands. That's the top 15
there are a few,
in that ranking.
Obviously, we're not going to analyse all top 15 in great detail because that would be very lengthy and require a lot of research on our part, because obviously we don't have in-depth knowledge of the French music scene. We can make our assumptions, of course, but Japan being number 2 really stood out to me. Especially ahead of places like South Korea, because K-pop is massive globally and here in Australia as well. To have Japan at number 2, it's not necessarily something that my algorithms are feeding me and not something I've been exposed to a lot. So that either shows one or two things. Either I'm just very ignorant, or 2, the local Japanese music scene is absolutely thriving, that they are, just on their own bat, making themselves number 2. And if that is the case, what can we learn from a country like Japan to try and increase our own local music scene to see us climbing back up into the top 10? Because obviously we know that our culture is mainly, USA and the UK, which, has its own pros and cons and where the cultures are coming and going. There are obvious ties there. But we need our music, I feel like, is one of those main places where our own unique identity and culture can really shine. You look at Play Lunch, for example. They are so Aussie culture. It is fantastic that they place so highly in the Hottest 100. They seem to be really thriving and trying to push that globally too. We spoke to them when we interviewed them in August, September last year, I think it was, about, going over to USA and say, here in Australia, we don't call them a bell pepper, but we know when they say bell pepper, they mean capsicum, right? That sort of stuff we can push that overseas too. We can make Australian references and they'll Google it and they will learn it. And that's how culture can sort of grow and expand. So are there lessons for us to take from Japan or China as well, who are number 4? Or Germany even at number 5? Are there things that we can learn from these sorts of cultures who I don't see as massive export markets?
Yeah, I would say Germany, I would say maybe a little bit more, particularly in the electronic space. So maybe perhaps that explains part of it. But also, we, for once, have a really good pass to be ignorant on this because we're an Australian music show and we don't really focus. Like, I listen to artists from around the world, but I don't really focus too much on what's going on globally. So our ignorance, I don't apologize for it here because we are constantly in the weeds of Australian music. But I do feel the same way. Japan, I didn't necessarily expect. Obviously, as you said, it does demonstrate clearly they're doing a lot of things right. And Japan as a country seem to have things made. If I can make a footballing reference, which will actually be relevant semi later in this podcast, but what they've done with their football leagues, with the J leagues, the J1, the J2, they had like a, I don't know, 30 or 50 year plan that they enacted in the 90s to eventually get them to win a World Cup. And they have like hit every milestone and exceeded it since then. They're clearly building a very healthy music market as well. They seem to just have what it takes to operate a country very, very well. So props to the Japanese. And yeah, perhaps we are just ignorant to the global exports of music coming out of there as well as their own thriving kind of national scene. South Korea's in there too. That's to be expected. K-pop is huge. France doesn't surprise me too much. China, yeah, I'm not super familiar with much music coming out of China. However, they are a nation of over 1 billion people, so it could simply be a really strong domestic market as well. But yeah, we've got Brazil and Mexico in that top 10 as well. The Latin American rise has been on artists like Bad Bunny, who played the Super Bowl, really kind of, I would say, normalizing in the best way possible, like Spanish-speaking music becoming very popular in English-speaking markets, which is great. And yeah, but for us here in Australia, dropping to 13th isn't very good. We have historically had a strong showing in this global market measure. We peaked as high as number 6 in 2004, and again from 2007 to 2015. We were kind of on the cusp of the top 10 come 2024, and then we've fallen out entirely. Which is interesting because from our perspective, you look at artists like Amel and the Sniffers, for example, who are doing massively overseas in a very Australian way. And, you know, a range of other artists, Royal Otis are another example, who have done really, really well globally. I mean, there's more that are there, but obviously, you know, we're not outpacing the gains being made elsewhere in the world. Whether that's just, you know, a natural shift, we can't hold this position forever, I don't know, or whether there's more to it that might relate to the lack of consumption of Australian music from Australians, which we've spoken about on the podcast before. I think that would have to play a role.
I think so, big time, because, you know, we've mentioned the drop-off of it, whether it's to do with algorithms and AI music playlists and Spotify and all these streaming services, plus the commercial radio are playing less Australian music. Like, you look at that, you know, 2007 to 2015, particularly, you know, 2007, you know, around that era, I would say that you had, you know, bands like Kiss Chasey, like all these Australian sort of bands who were being played on commercial radio. We're not really seeing, well, we're not seeing that at all anymore, really. And if you do, it might be one or two acts who are, you know, your Vance Joy still gets your commercial radio plays and that sort of stuff. But in terms of the bulk of what makes up a lot of I suppose, the consumption for Australians, it is coming mainly from the USA and the UK and these sorts of places. So I would say two things. One, our locals not listening to enough Australian music, but we sort of know that, and we know there's a vast number of reasons for this. But two, given our population size, the fact that we were in as high as 6th, I think is a great achievement for Australia. Like, we could, as much as we're saying it's a negative that we're slipping, I think we can turn this into a positive and say, yeah, based on our population, great to be as high as 6, you know, historically. We're obviously doing things right back then. Let's strive to do it right again in 2026.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a complex issue, and it could be just a natural leveling based on kind of population as other markets, you know, hit their own stride and find, you know, we are a small market, like we can't lose sight of that. We have been influential, but we are small. I'd be interested to compare population sizes of all of those countries in the top 15. And looking at it, I would say we are the smallest, I think, by population, looking at those numbers. But don't hold me to that. But I think we are. We'd be one of the smallest. So maybe that's a natural leveling out. I mean, we've got India still behind us. They've got 1 billion of their own. So they, may well overtake us soon in that list.
Yeah, maybe we were, punching above our weight, so to speak. Maybe we were... Yeah, as you say, it's just a natural leveling out, but it doesn't feel nice when you know how good our local music scene is, and we're obviously strong champions of it here in Homebrewed. To see it slipping, you're like, God, let's not slip. Let's strive to improve that and to get back into the top 10, because there's no real benefit, so to speak, in being in the top 10. It's not like you're in the top 10, you get this award or you get this recognition. Like, there's nothing in that sense for being in the top 10 other than a bit of an ego stroke to be like, how good are we? We're in the top 10. But I think it does show that, as I said, we've got good stuff here. We just need people here to recognize that. Yeah,
well, I think being in the top 10 also naturally translates into more money flowing into your music market, so that's a good thing, and that is a reward as well. But I think is that a reward, or is that just the being in the top 10 means that we're having more money flowing? Like, it's not necessarily... so you don't win it as an award, but it's definitely a benefit. I think maybe beyond ego for us to have that, because that obviously translates hopefully into opportunities for artists. But I think that there's more data in this report and some figures from ARIA as well that do show, I don't think we're in the best place, to be honest, based on this. So in this same report from IFPI, they said that recorded music revenues in the Australasian region, which includes Australia and New Zealand, among others, that was 623 million. That grew by 1.5%. Australia specifically increased revenue by 1.2%, which is an increase, but it's trailing the global average by a fair bit. The global average is 6.4%. So we're less than a quarter of that. And Australia is, in fact, the worst of any global market with regard to that number. New Zealand grew their recorded music revenues by 3%, so they're more than double. And they
so there goes the population argument.
True. So they contributed 15.2% of the Australasian region's revenues. Now, Lord released an album in that time period, so perhaps, or was that? Yeah, that was last year, I think. Anyway, that could contribute, but I don't think that is the whole story, of course. So. And then ARIA have some figures here, which, are positive generally. That the Australian recorded music industry posted its 7th consecutive year of growth in 2025, with wholesale sales rising 1.4%. Physical sales led the growth. Vinyl sales increased by 4%. CD sales, massive return, rising 29.6%. And premium streaming has grown 1.5%. Digital sales account for 91% of all music sales still. So that's interesting insight, particularly the physical stuff. But if I can return to Australia, increasing revenue by 1.2%, trailing the global average by more than a quarter. More than 3/4. I don't know if that's the right way to say that.
Why would you try to do maths?
I know, it's stupid. I apologize. Basically, we're low comparatively. And that's not good. And we've spoken a lot, as I alluded to, and Cam, you referenced it before, Australians aren't listening to Australian music as much anymore. We are so influenced now by the music coming through social media, like a lot of short form videos. Music trends are being set by whatever sound or song goes viral on TikTok or Instagram Reels, and then is then replicated millions of times around the world. And often those tracks come from the biggest markets, because that's where these trends emerge and we all follow. So it's a combined issue for Australian music visibility, Triple J listenership, because radio listenership generally amongst younger generations is down. The proportion of Australian music being played on commercial radio, we know, is kind of always dog shit. So these things are not good. I was having a conversation with a family member the other day, and they were saying, I hope they don't mind me sharing this, but they were saying that, Australia isn't producing any good bands anymore. basically, like you compare this to the 90s, we had X, Y, Z, it's not going on anymore. And I was like, well, no, I just think that you like the bands from the 90s. You're not paying attention to the bands that we're producing now. Like, I think it's kind of that simple. We know once we hit 30, we kind of lock into a music taste and likes, and we tend not to stray. Most people tend not to stray too far out of that. But it reflects an attitude that people clearly have towards our own music. And this was before I was going to the Radium Dolls gig, and I was like, no, well, I can list you, 15 bands from the Central Coast who are unreal and all emerging. I could list dozens more from around Australia who have been doing fantastic things, building audiences. Like, bands are always going to be there, and there's always going to be an audience that loves them. But I think it just kind of highlights the lack of visibility of Australian music, and maybe the lack of curiosity amongst Australians for our own music, which we do need to address. And that lack of listenership to Australian music, which we've spoken about in previous episodes, has to be contributing to these lower figures. If more streaming data royalties were going to these artists, more revenue being generated towards these artists instead of overseas artists, we would naturally be higher up. And that's a problem we need to arrest in this country, I think.
Yeah, I think it's partly exposure, which is all the issues that we've mentioned, already this episode and for the last however many years that we've been going through it. But also, the mentality around it, which I think comes with exposure. Like, I think you could link a desire or an openness to listen to Australian music, current, Australian music, compared to, the bands that we had in the 90s. Like, the music itself hasn't changed all that much. It's just how much they're willing to listen to that new music. Like, if you were a fan of, rock from the 80s, you can easily find, if you liked Cold Chisel, listen to Amyl and the Sniffers, and you can go, oh yeah, I can get around this. If you, there's always an equivalent with a slightly new flavor to it, but it's not like the music that you enjoyed in the 90s just isn't being made anymore. It is. You're either just not willing to give it a chance, like you mentioned, or, and I think it's connected, if the more exposed you are to this music, whether it's you're walking around Coles or Woolies and you're hearing it on their radio, or you're listening to it on the radio, commercial radio, you're listening to it on the TikTok algorithms, however you're being exposed to music, if you're being exposed to more Australian acts, you're probably more likely to be open to seeking it out as well. So I think those things are connected. And this probably ties in, again, really well into the final story that we're going to quickly mention.
It does, actually.
If you're happy and ready to move on, is some of the most premier acts or exposure moments that we have in this country are the NRL and the AFL Grand Finals. And for so long, and we've gone back through to 2018 in quick research for this, Australian acts have been starved of that stage. And Eamon and I have been very vocal and big proponents on giving Australians that stage as opposed to getting in international headliners. We know it's not purely just because of the event. It's more likely, TV stations dictating who they want because they can get more eyeballs on the TV coverage and therefore they can charge more for the advertising for that time slot. There's a lot that goes into it, but at the end of the day, if you want culture in Australia to rise, if you want an Australian to go to the AFL or NRL Grand Final to see an Australian musician and go, oh, they weren't half bad, I might check them out. Or they might go, wasn't my cup of tea, but they still get exposed to hearing more Australian music. And eventually that flow-on effect would be them seeking out Australian music, ideally.
Yeah, without a doubt. We've spoken about this a fair bit. Just for context, last year's NRL Grand Final had Teddy Swims playing and AFL had Snoop Dogg playing. And for the longest time, we've been, critical of these decisions while understanding. I wasn't very understanding at first. Cam, you raised some points over our various discussions on this that have kind of brought me around. There are commercial decisions at play. Companies are wanting to make as much money as they can. That is a reality. Like it or not, that is going to reign supreme with these kinds of decisions.
I'm curious, sorry, just before we move on a little bit more to, I suppose, the bulk of what we want to talk about. NRL in 2024 had the Kid Leroy headline, which was met with criticism because the NRL crowd are a very sensitive bunch when it comes to apparently pre-game entertainment. And AFL had Katy Perry which we were also vocal about at the time of our displeasure of Katy Perry being selected. And not nothing personal against Katy Perry, but just in general, the same rule applied to Snoop Dogg and Teddy Swims. Like, we just don't think an international act should be getting there. But the point I was wanting to make, the Kid Leroy in 2024, massive Australian artist. In 2018, they had Gang of Youths. So they have experimented with having Australians. I would like to know, did the bottom line change for the NRL or Channel 9 by having Australian acts on there? Obviously, we don't know, but I would be very curious. If the bottom line didn't change, what's the harm? Why spend millions getting international acts to come when if the bottom line doesn't change too much? Give these Aussies more exposure. Anyway, I'm ranting.
I agree. Well, so the story we're talking about, which we haven't quite headlined, it's around grand finals, the A-League grand final. So Cam and I are big A-League fans, so there's a bit of bias here, and we'll get into like a bit more detail about this. But Kobie Dee, Sydney rapper, unreal, Indigenous Australian, playing the grand final. He's a Gomeroi rapper. He's from Bidjigal land, or in Maroubra, which is Maroubra or South Sydney. He is, if you're not familiar with Kobie Dee, he's an excellent storyteller, like really, really, really good Australian rapper, excellent storyteller based on his lived experience, a fierce advocate for Indigenous Australian First Nations youth. He's like a fantastic example of an artist that should be platformed at these events. Of course, the A-League doesn't have, the reach nor the money that the AFL, the NRL have. And when I saw this news, I kind of sent it to Cam and I was like, honestly, if the A-League had the money to get which they don't, to get an international artist, that's millions of dollars. Like, I don't know how much Snoop Dogg would have cost, but it would have been in the millions by the time his posse comes and accommodation and the crew and everything that would come with him. The A-League doesn't have that money. So that's not an option for them. And if they had the money, the cynic in me says, well, they'd probably be trying it too. But at least we have an opportunity where, it's a relatively kind of well-attended, highly viewed, at least among the Australian football community and some global football communities, competition. This is going to be a good exposure point for Kobie Dee. And the thoughts I've always had around this were like, well, as much as we love seeing musicians at these events, most sports fans are going because they want to watch their team win, or they want to watch the spectacle of the sport game. So the music is inevitably going to be secondary to that. So why are the AFL paying all this money to get Snoop Dogg over when you're not going to sell tickets based off of that? You're selling tickets based off of teams' fans. Cam made the point, well, it's probably to do with the TV deal, and you're going to get more people tuning in to watch Snoop Dogg play the grand final than if it were an artist that they from Australia that they mightn't have heard of or whatever else. And that's a fair argument, I suppose. But I still think, this should be an Australian artist for Australian leagues all the time, no matter what league it is, what sport it is. It really should be Australian artists because of what it represents. But yeah, the good news is that the A-League is having Kobie Dee play at the grand final this year. So we wanted to just kind of highlight that and celebrate that. And if you're not around Kobie Dee, have a listen and check it out if you are a fan of hip hop. It's his first time performing at a major national sporting event as well, which is really, really cool. Sorry, Ken.
Sorry, I was going to say, this was my point to you when you shared this story with me. I was like, I'm not familiar with who Kobie Dee is. I'll openly admit I didn't know who he was. But I think part of the idea is if I went along to that grand final and I saw Kobie Dee perform at halftime, I could still walk away going, nah, it wasn't for me. But I could walk away and go, he was actually pretty good. I might check him out. And the benefit of that being an Australian musician in that position, as opposed to, maybe you didn't know who Teddy Swims was before he played the NRL grand final, and you've gone, oh, he was pretty good, I might check him out. But the benefit of when that was Gang of Youths, how many people walked away and went, they were pretty cool, I'm going to, add them to my streaming service. That's sort of the benefit that has, not just the, I suppose, plainly the exposure that the musician gets, but also, people who weren't aware of who they were could walk away going, they were pretty cool. Or they might not, but there's no real loss there for the musician, I don't think. It's only a benefit, so give that benefit to the local Australian product.
Yeah, without a doubt. And it contributes to what we were discussing in the previous story. So we need Australian exposure to Australian music. It's not happening in a lot of other places, not in our online worlds. The streaming algorithm isn't doing it very well. Radio listenership is down. This is an opportunity to showcase great Australian artists to Australians. And it should be. It's like the same logic behind the campaign that Jack Rivers spearheaded around like Australian businesses playing Australian music within their businesses. So, which to their credit, like, you know, Coles, Bunnings, whatever else, they are quite good at that. You do hear Australian music in there often. And that was as a result of a campaign from Australian musicians that did that. But it's the same principle, is that if we want to foster a healthy community, a healthy cultural community and a healthy music scene, we have to be, you know, showing it to ourselves and offering those opportunities which aren't being offered elsewhere. And so whenever these decisions are made for an international artist, we're losing that. And I feel like, you know, this is again removing money from it, which is the driving force behind these decisions. But as a principle, as a league, if you're in a national league, sport is a massive part of our national culture. Like, you should be principled to the point where you're like, no, we have Australian artists. That's something that we do irrespective of whoever else is available or whatever that might mean for the money. But that is a very idealist view of that. But, yeah, this is part of how we can solve some of the problems we were speaking about in the last story. Only a part of it, of course, but it is a part of it. And for as long as you know, those leagues refuse to do that, then they're not necessarily helping that problem.
Yeah, and on the point of money as well, and I also countered that argument with another argument in my head. So I'll explain both of those arguments, I suppose.
Cam's arguing with himself.
I am, and it happens a lot. I have a point, and then I think of a counterpoint, and I'm like, well, you know, I suppose that point's invalid, but maybe both points are equally valid. I don't know. I'm going to share them with you. Point of money, and this might be the final thing we touch on because I'm conscious we've been maybe going a little bit long. But Kobie Dee at the A-League Grand Final that we mentioned, we praised, and we said it's likely because the A-League don't have the money that the NRL or the AFL do, right? They have the money, they brought in internationals, but the Australian Open tennis, right? They're one of the big major tennis tournaments in the world. We have the best tennis players from everywhere coming here. We have tennis fans from everywhere coming here. The Australian Open have money. They could get Teddy Swims and Snoop Dogg and Katy Perry and the Killers. They could bring in all the international acts who we've seen headline NRL AFL over the last few years in the one bill at the Australian Open tennis. Instead, this year in January, the Australian Open had the Kid Laroi, Spacey Jane, the Veronicas, Sophie Tucker, Renee Rapp. I would argue a pretty good mix of local and international headliners there. They have the money. So the point that the NRL and the AFL, they have the money, so they're going to go overseas. I argue the Australian Open, possibly more money. I don't know how much money they have to spend on entertainment comparatively, but they have money. They could have brought in all international acts. They chose not to. That's point one in my head.
Yeah, kudos. And that is a fair call, 100%. I actually was reading during this year's Australian Open. I can't remember the exact context, but basically the crux of the article was that the Australian Open or the Australian Tennis Association or whatever they're called that kind of operates it has heaps of money, was kind of what they were getting at. It was kind of, I can't remember exactly why, but they're not short of a quid. So what you're saying is correct, that they definitely could have searched for international artists, but they made the effort to showcase, you know, many Australian acts which, you know, deserve it and should be showcased to Australian audiences. I
agree. So this is where then the counterpoint came into my head, which is where there were a few counterpoints actually. Number one, to my knowledge, those entertainments are not broadcast on TV, which was a big factor as to why we hypothesized NRL and AFL have international acts to get the eyeballs on their TV before the ads. The Australian Open, to my knowledge, do not broadcast those entertainments. That is for people on the ground. Number two counterpoint is that NRL and AFL are very much Australian games. You're going to have very few people coming from overseas to view the grand final. Compared to the Australian Open, you might have a lot more people from overseas coming to view the Australian Open tennis because it is much more of a global event. Similar to the Formula One that's in Melbourne, it's a much more of a global event compared to NRL AFL grand finals. And as such, the organisers might make a conscious decision to try and make the event as, quote, Australian as possible So when international people come to Melbourne to watch the Australian Open tennis, they have Australian musicians playing. Much like if I went over to the French Open tennis, I would expect and hope for it to be as French as possible to have the whole experience as opposed to seeing the Red Hot Chili Peppers headlining or something, So that's the second counter argument, is that it's much more of an international spectacle, and they don't have, as far as I'm aware, they don't broadcast those performances.
Yeah, I see the point, particularly the broadcast one as well, which, I suppose that there are definitely two sides to the coin, but on a fundamental level, I still believe, and we still believe, that they should just be prioritising Australian artists no matter what, and it's good to see the A-League doing that. We would love to know your thoughts as well. If you have thoughts on this too, let us know. Like, does this affect you like it affects us? We're obviously Australian music advocates. We talk about this a lot, so we're going to be scrutinising grand final performance installments more than the average punter, but we are keen to know what you reckon about this. So let us know if you do have a particular view on this, or if you think we harp on too much about this. We're interested to know everything.
Well, actually, I've literally just remembered AFL have already announced their 2026 grand final entertainment, and it's Kylie Minogue. So an Australian and also a Victorian as well. So whilst we've just been shitting on the AFL for the last 10 minutes, I think they deserve credit for that. But
they
as
do.
you said,
No, they do. I stand by what we said, though, to be honest, for the previous years, but that is great.
Yeah, it is great. And eyes will firmly be on the NRL, because the NRL love to get one up over the AFL. Wherever they can, they will take, like last year, they were taking pot shots that they had Snoop Dogg and NRL had Teddy Swims. They were making jokes about the little puppy dog or whatever they were saying that the AFL had for entertainment. Completely unnecessary. But on that note, the NRL do love to get one up over the AFL. So I will be watching very keenly and intently on who they choose for their entertainment. Please, please, please let it be an Australian.
Yes. The floor is yours, NRL. But that is great to see from the AFL. So credit where it's due. Hopefully it continues. But yeah, that'll do us. We've covered some ground on this music news. Hope you've enjoyed it. Let us know your thoughts. You can comment on Spotify, I think, if you're listening to this on Spotify.
Yep.
I'm not sure about
YouTube.
the other platforms. YouTube, you can comment, of course. We love it. We've been getting a bit more interaction lately, which is always very good to see, because this is a discussion we like to have with you, not to you. So yeah, please do let us know your thoughts. We will return next week with an interview with Zoe from The Boys. So keep your eyes and ears peeled for that one. Really, really good chat. Very, very good chat. So keep your eyes and ears peeled for that chat. But that's us. Goodbye.
See ya.